Hello and welcome to our audience members joining us from across the globe. I'm Raymond Karam, the Chief Program and Development Officer here at AGSIW. We're truly pleased to be hosting this discussion today, looking at the future of hydrogen development in the Gulf as countries like Saudi Arabia, Oman, and the UAE are advancing hydrogen-focused initiatives. We have an excellent panel of experts with us today. I'll introduce them very briefly here and share a link to their full bios in the chat. First, I'd like to welcome Phillip Cornell, the Global Practice Lead at Economist Impact and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. He is a specialist in energy and foreign policy, global energy markets, regulatory issues, critical energy infrastructure protection, Saudi oil policy, Gulf energy economics, and sustainable energy transition policy. Also, welcome to our good friend Kate Dourian. She is a non-resident fellow at AGSIW, a contributing editor at MEES, and a fellow at the Energy Institute. Previously, she was the regional manager for the Middle East and Gulf states at the World Energy Council, as well as the program officer for the Middle East and North Africa at the International Energy Agency. I'm also happy to welcome back Rami Shabaneh. He is a fellow with the Oil and Gas Program at the King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center with a focus on global gas and hydrogen markets. He has nearly 15 years of research and industry experience analyzing energy markets and energy policy. Last but not least is my colleague Eleanor Bosch. She is a visiting scholar at AGSIW. Her research currently focuses on green energy and the effect of climate change and the energy transition in the Gulf. She's also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. Moderating the session today is my colleague Robert Mogielnicki, senior resident scholar at AGSIW. He created and leads the Next Gen Gulf series, examining technology trends in the Gulf Arab states and looking east, the China Gulf Initiative. And with that, Robert, over to you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Raymond. Look, I think in recent years, there has been a sense of investment and policy momentum related to hydrogen, and we can clearly see this in the Gulf. Even someone like me who's not operating daily in the energy trenches like my colleagues here can see how energy is popping up across a wide range of domains that are critical for the region's political economy. We're seeing hydrogen popping up in national strategies. I mean, there are actually hydrogen-focused strategies in the activities of NOCs. Even in sovereign wealth fund investments, in particular projects within special economic zones, government-related entities, some of which were created specifically to look at hydrogen or to promote green hydrogen development, and then a range of other economic development strategies. Now, I've had the pleasure of speaking about this and related subjects with Rami in Saudi Arabia at CAPSARC, with Phil over lunch here in DC, Kate with and through our Petro Diplomacy event, and she's been nice enough to take some phone calls late at night as well from me to discuss this issue. And of course, Eleanor here at our institute, where we're so happy to have her as a visiting scholar. And this is an excellent panel. I'm so happy that you all could join us today. Now, during these conversations and many others I've had over the years, it became apparent to me that even amongst Gulf energy experts, there is a wide range of views about domestic and international demand related to hydrogen, technology maturity timelines, cost projection, competition between different producers, the availability and also suitability of energy infrastructure for hydrogen standards, and the list goes on and on. There are those who are very optimistic and enthusiastic about hydrogen's potential in the region, and there are those who are much more suspect and critical. So I'm going to leave my comments there. I'm going to cut them off. I usually would drone on for a little bit longer to set the scene, but we have four really plugged in and informed speakers. I want you to hear what they have to say. So I'm going to pass the digital ball, so to speak, over to Kate. And I mean, Kate, you steer a lot of our institute's work on energy, and you have a really good sense of the energy landscape in the Gulf. Can you help us situate hydrogen within this energy landscape? Where is it today? Where is the kind of status and state of hydrogen development today? And where do you think it's likely to go? Over to you, Kate.
Oh, thanks, Robert. It has, it's moved from hype to action. But it's still a very, very small part of the energy mix, not just in the region, but I mean around the world. You're talking maybe 1% of primary energy. It's being scaled up. And I suppose one of the advantages that we have in the Gulf states is that you do have very low cost renewable energy. You have the wide open spaces. And now we're seeing development of infrastructure and manufacturing of components for electrolyzers, for example. You've seen deals being made in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Oman. So that, and particularly now, as we're talking about supply chain issues and, the Red Sea situation, that becomes even more important. And I suppose the impetus began before COP28, but I think now that we are really seriously talking about sort of transitioning away from fossil fuels, the countries of the Gulf that are still very oil dependent, let's face it, are positioning themselves more. They're committing more to sort of low carbon, even if it's not for export. I think one of the downsides is that you don't actually have a global market. It's not an aggregated demand market. And so offtake agreements are still a lot of countries, a lot of companies that are involved in green hydrogen. You listen to Aramco saying, we're just waiting for offtake agreements that aren't long term, that they have to reflect costs of production because they're still pretty high. Blue hydrogen is obviously cheaper to produce, and we do have gas in the region. But I think I do agree with a lot of the analysts who say, we shouldn't be colorblind when it comes to hydrogen. At the end of the day, if it's blue or green, if it's low carbon, then it's far better than burning coal, for example. So I think the reality is setting in. But again, we are going to be talking about COP28 and the aftermath afterwards. But a water issue is another thing that I wanted to mention, because where's the water coming from? It's going to be desalinated water that's going to be used in the electrolyzers. That's another issue that I think has to be tackled, particularly now that we're talking about, reducing methane emissions, energy efficiency, and so on. So all these pledges that were made at COP28, plus financing, I don't think is very difficult for the UAE and Saudi Arabia. Maybe a bit more for Oman, even though they have made deals with, major companies like Shell, BP. They've got an agreement with Siemens for electrolyzers, but I think a lot of the projects that they're planning may not actually happen, at least not on target, not by, I think Saudi Arabia might be the first by 2026. Rami will correct me if I'm wrong. So I think until you have an aggregated market, until you have a global hydrogen market, I think it's going to be very difficult to sort of see where we're heading. But I think the projects are proceeding. But it's a long-term, these are long-term projects. They're not going to happen overnight. And it's going to take a lot of investment. You're talking trillions. So you still need oil revenues to drive your green transition. And I think that's where the countries are still going to be relying on, so, what are still volatile oil prices.
So what I'm sensing from what you're saying about this being a long-term process is we have a number of other conversations in our future, which will number of you back to attend. That's a good, I think, time to move over to Phil, and I'm going to put more or less a similar question to you, Phil. I mean, what's your view on how realistic the Gulf's hydrogen ambitions are? And I wonder if you could take it perhaps in two different directions. Maybe one, by answering with a focus on the particular countries that you're following most closely, where you see the most potential, the countries and the projects they're in, and also giving us a sense of what are some of the obstacles that these planners need to think about as they try to advance these hydrogen initiatives.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Robert. And thanks to the fellow panelists and to the audience for listening to us today. No, I think what Kate said is pretty spot on. Look, I think the region has a really significant potential to adopt hydrogen production and green hydrogen production for a few reasons. One, it's because it's a good way to leverage existing infrastructure that is sort of dedicated to molecules in the region. And so while, as Kate mentions, oil and gas production will continue to be far more a part of the economy than hydrogen anytime in the near future, there's a lot of opportunity, again, to leverage existing infrastructure, existing skills, existing expertise, and existing trading relationships. On the other hand, as we heard, green hydrogen in particular requires enormous amounts of renewable energy. And what the region does have is obviously very high and quality renewable energy resources around solar, obviously, and also wind. And in places like solar, obviously, sports in places like the UAE and Saudi, the lowest production costs in the world. So already you have an enormous potential there to build the hydrogen market. The issue when it comes to scaling is really how do we address a market? So there's a big demand side issue, I think, which Kate also touched on, which is given that we don't already have an existing global hydrogen market, one doesn't currently exist, these offtake agreements and securing demand, building up that demand through, for example, advanced market commitments is extremely important to continuing investment into these big projects. Now, when we look at the Gulf region in particular, those three countries that were highlighted, the UAE, Saudi, and Oman, are really sort of the places that we're focusing on. For each of these, in each of their cases, there are already projects that are up and going that have even started construction. A lot of the issue has been delays in achieving FID or final investment decision. So in places like Oman and in Neom in Saudi Arabia, a lot of that construction has already started absent FIDs, but those we expect are going to be closing. And there's a few reasons why. We expect them to be closing in around 2026, 2027. I think that's partly because of a schedule of how subsidy programs are going to be applied within the Gulf. This is another reason why this region has a potential to grow much faster because of their accessing not only to cheap financing domestically and to and having sort of a better investment environment and policy environment, a more stable policy environment for investment, both in the green hydrogen plants and in the renewable energy projects that need to feed them, but also because of the availability of public financing through subsidies. And so as those come into fruition in 2026, 2027, I think we're going to kind of see a pickup. But the other reason, if we think about sort of the European market, and there's two markets that are being served by demand, I think, at least projected for over the next 10 years. It's in Europe, and in Asia, it's sort of Japan and Korea, to some degree China, but really Japan and Korea that we're talking about. And on the European side, that demand question is also stymied to some degree by a complex and ongoing regulatory framework, particularly for green hydrogen, which can complicate and slow some of the investment decisions on the supply side. But just looking at some of the details of those projects that are being launched. So the first industrial scale green hydrogen project was launched by Dubai Electricity and Water Authority in 2021. And as Kate mentioned, particularly coming out of COP28 for the UAE government, hydrogen production is going to be a key element of their mix. Qatar in 2022 announced plans to build a large blue ammonia plant. And then, of course, we're talking about Neom as well, which expects to produce about 1.2 million tons of green hydrogen per year by 2026. And so, and then in Oman, I think the other interesting one is to look at what's happening in sort of the Duqm free trade zone. And last year, the Omani hydrogen company, Hydrom, signed 3 agreements for the development of projects worth $20 billion and are expected to produce 500,000 tons per year between now, once they sort of achieve production by 2030. And that puts Oman on track to become the 6th largest exporter globally and the biggest in the Middle East by the end of the decade. Again, a lot of this hydrogen is expected to be consumed domestically, but the real market that we're looking at here is where they can export to. And the commissioning of that project is targeted at the end of 2025 and the beginning of 2026. Again, both of these projects have functioned because they found proper off-takers. So in the case of the ACME, which is launching this project in the Duqm zone, there's a binding sheet agreement with a massive fertilizer giant. And then also Intercontinental Energy in Oman is working with partners like Shell and OQ to develop green energy projects. And this again is sort of dependent on these large off-takers. So as a developer, it's really about securing not only the large amount of renewable energy resources, because let's remember, particularly when we talk about green hydrogen, the jobs, the investment, the infrastructure that's required to build the renewable energy projects which feed these green hydrogen is something like 4 or 5 times more than the actual hydrogen plant. So it really comes down to the ease when it comes to green hydrogen of building renewable energy projects. And I think that's something that the Gulf has a real advantage in, and something that developers are going to be looking to.
Thanks, Phil. Rami, you're tuning in from Saudi Arabia. Obviously, many of us know that in Neom there is a major focus on green hydrogen as a part of that broader project in the special economic zone. You don't have to focus your comments on Neom especially, but feel free to weigh in if you'd like on how you're seeing that project evolve and the green hydrogen dimension playing a role there. But I did want to ask, pick up on a point Phil made that I think you can really help elaborate for us. It has to do with the domestic demand side of this equation. I mean, how important is domestic demand for hydrogen, at least over the kind of short and medium terms when we're looking at hydrogen development in the region? And then as we move toward thinking about the kind of export markets, how are the kind of standards coming into play, and how are folks in the region that are invested in hydrogen development thinking about the standards and the regulatory environments that are emerging in key export, potential export markets like in Europe?
Yeah, thanks, Robert, and thanks for the invitations. It's great to be here. Yeah, a lot of the activity in the GCC has centered around the intent to develop large-scale production projects and earmark those volumes for exports, especially after the EU and just like Philip mentioned, Japan and South Korea have shown this eagerness and the need for imports. But we're also seeing in parallel efforts towards using clean hydrogen for domestic markets to extract the most value out of hydrogen. The UAE's national hydrogen strategy, for example, actually focuses more on using hydrogen for their local industries and stimulating local demand rather than exports. And I think having that parallel strategy is a good strategy rather than focusing on export markets, because like my fellow panelists mentioned, the pace of demand and regulations for using hydrogen in exporting markets could take some time to develop, and there are near-term challenges when it comes to transporting hydrogen over long distances and its costs. And on the other hand, the GCC have set net zero targets on a national level and also on a company level, such as national oil companies, national petrochemical companies that have a high emission profile where clean hydrogen could be the most cost-effective way to decarbonize these sectors. And let's not forget that the GCC countries do produce a significant amount of hydrogen today. Think about 9 million tons per annum. And that's all in the form of gray hydrogen or hydrogen produced from natural gas without carbon mitigation or carbon capture and sequestration. So there is a need to decarbonize and reconfigure these existing facilities to produce clean hydrogen to achieve their net zero targets. But more needs to be done in terms of incentives and regulatory framework to drive this local demand for clean hydrogen away from gray hydrogen, but also for some sectors to drive them away from carbon-intensive fuels. And so far, these are regulations and incentives are almost absent in the region. How can this demand be fostered? Well, we can learn a lot from the renewable electricity sector. I mean, experience globally. Renewables were very expensive 15, 16 years ago compared to conventional fuels, just like hydrogen today. But renewable mandates or having a renewable energy quota as part of your energy mix was an important policy tool that policymakers implemented to enable growth for green electricity. In the US, it's known as renewable portfolio standards. Other jurisdiction called renewable purchase obligations, but you can have a similar mandate or quotas for hydrogen. Have some existing industries use clean hydrogen, but of course those also would need some supporting policies along with those quotas to make the business case for end users to switch to clean hydrogen. One thing that worked, for example, in the UK were the contracts for difference, that helped the UK wind industry flourish. So it's good to see, the UAE and their national strategy, their hydrogen national strategy, also make that point about they're exploring the tools like contracts for difference or CFDs to incentivize end users in procuring clean hydrogen. So these tools are being looked at as we speak. So that kind of a top-down approach could encourage and build up demand and provide comfort to lenders and producers to set up infrastructures, especially in the early stages of market development. Now, your question about exports, the necessary standards or the standards coming out from Europe and elsewhere, and how does the Gulf respond? I mean, yeah, you're right. In terms of meeting standards to ensure exports to international markets, hydrogen will be demand driven. One of the challenges for hydrogen exporter is that they become vulnerable to the standards imposed by importing countries, especially the sustainability attributes or the environmental attributes that will define what clean hydrogen is in order for them to receive state provisions. And anyone that wants access to those markets will need to abide by these standards. The problem is that each market or jurisdiction will have a different set of standards or definition of what they believe is clean hydrogen. They will have different carbon intensity thresholds, different production pathways, they source their hydrogen, the emissions boundaries and how you calculate the emissions and how you track them. So for example, Europe in the middle of last year published what they defined as renewable hydrogen or green hydrogen, and they emphasize that it needs to meet, these criteria of additionality, that hydrogen needs to be produced from new renewable energy and not cannibalize existing renewable production. And they also emphasize that renewable production should have a temporal and geographical correlation with the hydrogen produced. The US, by the way, seems to be heading that way as well. In Japan, on the other hand, they just care about the carbon intensity and not really how your electricity system is set up. So from a GCC perspective, when you're building these multi-billion-dollar export facilities, we want to guarantee that the hydrogen is sold to many markets as possible. But there's this risk that it might be accepted in one market but rejected in another. So that is why that declaration of intent that was signed in COP28 to mutually recognize the clean hydrogen certification schemes across jurisdictions is important because it allows governments to work together and see, well, how can we have kind of a convergence in these standards and work towards international traded hydrogen.
Great. That's a really good opportunity to transfer, to move over to Eleanor to speak about COP28. I get the sense that a lot of people involved in COP28 in the UAE are still recovering, and Eleanor is on the ground there as was many others. Eleanor, can you give us a sense of some of the conversations you had and the discussions you heard while you were at COP28, those focused on or related to hydrogen development? What were the key takeaways? What do you see as important implications for moving forward from COP28 for hydrogen development in the Gulf? Rami mentioned the declaration of intent. I'm sure we'll comment on that too, but also other important developments that you observed while you were there.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, in general, COP28 was really buzzing with technological panels and big announcements, right? So in the blue zone, when negotiations were happening, it was really the first time, I believe, that green hydrogen was seriously talked about as a key component of the world's energy transition. Regarding blue hydrogen, there was a declaration of intent that included a pledge to prioritize renewable hydrogen for displacing the current use of fossil-based H2, which of course is produced from coal or gas. And use it in hard-to-abate sectors where the molecule makes the most sense to decarbonize. It seems to me when you talk to hydrogen investors, big funds, that it's been a very long process, given those experts kind of on the technical side and on the financial side have been working on making this happen for at least 10 or 15 years, right? So in the green zone of COP28, there were many green hydrogen panels. I attended, for example, a panel made entirely of Dutch companies because Rotterdam, as well as Antwerp in Belgium, are gearing up to be the ports on the end of the hydrogen route. I guess the big turning point, because we were talking about the demand side of this economic model, is that the big turning point, I think, in the creation of the hydrogen market was the EU strategy on hydrogen published in 2020, where they said that they would produce 10 million tons of green hydrogen and import as much by 2030. And so, of course, the Gulf and North Africa were deemed best positioned to fulfill the EU goal. And GCC and European investment funds are joining forces to make it happen. So I think a lot of deals were made in the green zone during COP28, or at least a lot of conversations. It is a mutually beneficial partnership because Europe does not have the land to produce, or not much land to produce green hydrogen, in part because it's too densely populated and the Gulf is not that far. And for the Gulf, they get, technology and expertise to develop the supply chain. I think also Germany's H2 Global Initiative was another big turning point in the demand side of the hydrogen market, when they declared they would they would pay the difference between those who sell and those who want to buy green hydrogen. It seems to me like blue hydrogen is also, I think, a big part of the GCC planning. But of course, as Rami mentioned, it is, it would be seen as like greenwashing by the European Union. So GCC's green hydrogen ambitions, I think, are mostly economic ones, with several goals. The first, most obvious, is replacing oil-generated rents with hydrogen-generated ones. The second is clearly to keep their status as the world's supplier of affordable energy, with the global influence that goes with it. That's kind of what came out of COP.
Thank you. The point you made about kind of serving as an alternate form of rents, or we could also think, public sector revenues as well, is a point I really want to circle back to. But before I do, I'm going to actually give the other speakers a chance to give us any ideas that they have or any thoughts that they have about important implications that have come out of COP28, either discussions that were held, initiatives, agreements, and kind of what they're thinking moving on from COP28, if it has, what impact it has had on hydrogen's development trajectory within the region. A small caveat before I turn things over to the other speakers on COP28. For those listening, if you have questions, do not wait. You don't have to wait for another half an hour or so. Pop those questions right into the Q&A. Somebody did that right now, so thank you. And that will give us a chance to integrate them a little bit more naturally into the conversation. So to the other speakers, I know all of you were involved in one way, shape, or form and closely following COP28. Would you like to add on to what Eleanor had to say?
Sure. I'm happy to jump in, Robert. Sorry, okay. No, I think Eleanor, particularly in terms of covering the Intergovernmental Declaration of Intent, I think that was really a key thing to come out of COP28. Again, the presidency in the UAE made this sort of a high priority. They launched a COP presidency's sort of a high-level roundtable on hydrogen. But I think there was a couple of other sort of technical agreements that came out of COP28 that are important to note. So one is having an ISO, a standards methodology that provides a global benchmark for emissions assessments from hydrogen on a life cycle analysis basis. I mean, I talked a little bit about how in Europe there's a complex sort of regulatory discussion going on about defining green hydrogen. How do we define and then again benchmark the emissions that comes out of the hydrogen cycle? And as Eleanor mentioned, also in Japan, or maybe that was Rami, that in Japan, the carbon intensity of hydrogen is incredibly important. So how we calculate those are important. I think COP28 set down some good rules for this. And there was also a public-private action statement on cross-border trade corridors. So this is really, with sort of the Hydrogen Trade Forum, a question about how do we create sort of the trade routes that can help develop markets and match that supply and demand. So I think going into COP28, clearly hydrogen was taken very seriously, and some of these very specific agreements are probably going to have a beneficial effect. But please, Kate, let me turn over to you.
Thanks. Now, what I was going to say is, I mean, if you look at COP, the previous COP in Egypt, there were a lot of, there's usually a rush of, signings and MOUs being signed. They don't always materialize. I was talking to the CEO of ENI, and he said, it's very difficult to get these projects off the ground because you're talking to two different ministries. You're talking to the Ministry of Oil. They're used to, dealing with the fossil fuel industry, with oil and gas. When it comes to the electricity ministry, you're actually dealing with, something completely new, and they don't have the expertise. So I wouldn't give much stock, but as you said, there were some specific agreements at COP28 that take us further. And I think it's interesting to note the way that the energy industry in the UAE, for example, has been restructured with ADNOC, Masdar, TAQA. ADNOC is now in charge of the green hydrogen part of the, this newly structured energy entity. So I think it's important when you have this merger of, an oil and gas company that can manage these huge, big, mega energy projects, which has the infrastructure, which has the manpower, and let's face it, the cash, that they are now actually involved in the green, green hydrogen business. And I think, you forget about exports because nobody really knows how much they intend to export, but I think decarbonizing industry is one of the key planks of the strategy in the UAE. And I think steel is one area that can be. So if you listen to, say, the CEO of Total, he doesn't see hydrogen having a role in power generation, but in hard to abate sectors. And I think the UAE is doing that. So I think we're seeing, regardless of COP28, I think that the process had started and probably accelerate as a result of the agreements that were made at COP28.
Great. I'm going to give Rami the chance to add anything he would like on COP28. I won't take that away from you, but I might also add an additional point that Kate put onto the table, which has to do with some of those hard to abate sectors. What are looking beyond? I mean, Phil gave us a kind of one end of the spectrum, saying we can't think about hydrogen without thinking about the broader renewable energy infrastructure underpinning these development plans. But on the other end of the spectrum, there's a number of different industries and sectors that are also likely to be impacted by hydrogen development. So to your mind, what are some, Kate mentioned steel, what are some other high priority industries and sectors that are likely to be impacted here, and that those in our audience and other investors should keep an eye on?
Yeah, thanks, Robert. Just with the COP28 reflections, the COP28 presidency this year or last year was a very inclusive COP. They tried to make it a very inclusive COP, and I think that was part of the discussions, or some of the discussions that I've attended, including the declaration of intent that was signed, that they wanted to be all inclusive when it comes to hydrogen from all sources, and only focus on the carbon intensity of hydrogen. So the declaration of intent does acknowledge both, renewable and low carbon hydrogen, as they call it in the document. So they see a role of both playing a role, for in the energy transition. So I thought that, I guess that was progress, that, we're moving away from the colors and moving towards this, just focusing on the carbon intensity to play a solution for the energy transition. Now, when it comes to, where do we prioritize hydrogen, it seems like the definition of hard to abate sector changes every year. I mean, we at the beginning, when the hydrogen hype, so-called hype started, we thought this hydrogen is going to be, the Swiss Army knife for everything. Can be, theoretically, it could replace fossil fuels in all end uses. But there's hydrogen is expensive, it's costly, and it's probably has to be prioritized for sectors that are hard to electrify. So a lot of the end uses could be electrified and using renewable energy, but it's these sectors that really the marginal cost of abatement becomes very expensive when you use electricity, and you need green molecules instead. And hydrogen there is a contender. So just like Kate mentioned, especially here in the region, steel could be a very, very good market, to decarbonize. The GCC, is not a big exporter of steel, compared to the rest of the world, but they do own, 50% of the DRI process is in this region. And currently they use natural gas to reduce iron. That could be converted to hydrogen, and so that could be a great opportunity for the steel industry here. Other sectors could involve aviation. So, the PIF, a lot of the sovereign wealth fund are invested in SAF, sustainable aviation fuels here. That's one thing that they are looking at. And the other one is also marine bunkering. The GCC, sits, very nicely between these east-west shipping lanes, and could also take advantage of those. So these three sectors, I think steel, aviation, and shipping will be a good opportunity for the GCC to focus on.
Great. Thank you, Rami. I'd like to, Eleanor, I saw you nodding there and your hand raised. Would you like to jump in?
Sorry. Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to add the sectors that I was hearing about when I was at COP were like aviation, heavy industries in general, but also fertilizers, so agriculture.
Great. Look, I'd like to maybe zoom out a little bit here and pick up on the kind of competitive dynamics of this debate and just think about some of the other potential producers. I mean, we're kind of honed in, especially here at the Arab Gulf States Institute, on the Gulf, and a lot of our conversation, because of the title of the topic today, is focused on the Gulf. But when we're talking about green hydrogen, there are a number of other places one could imagine that you could look for that would have the solar capabilities and wind capabilities, others, renewable energy capabilities to also produce hydrogen. And even in the discussion today, we've kind of heard some mention about North Africa. I mean, there are other players who are producing hydrogen globally. So I'm curious what all of you think about where the Gulf stands globally speaking. Who are the other key players that are likely to emerge over the coming years in terms of hydrogen producers that we should also be keeping an eye on? And what are the important differences between the Gulf and these producers? Maybe we'll start with Phil.
Sure. Happy to jump in on this one. So I think that there's, a few sort of spots around the world where we're seeing large hydrogen projects develop. There's some in Africa, for example, in Namibia, where there's a big base, largely because of the renewable resources that are available there. Also Australia. But I think one of the interesting ones to really notice is here in the US, and the role that the Inflation Reduction Act has played in pushing forward a green hydrogen market here. really through essentially direct subsidies. And that's something like a $2 subsidy on a kilogram of green hydrogen in particular, which brings the costs from something like $4 to $6 down to something like $2 to $4, at which point you can really see it be competitive with other forms of hydrogen production. And also the encouragement of these hydrogen hubs within the US coming out of the IRA. Now, we're talking about COP28. One of the big talk at COP were also about specific rules that we're waiting on out of the US, particularly about how we define. Again, it comes down to that definition of what exactly is green hydrogen. I think Rami touched on this question of, is the electricity 100% renewable all the time? Is it electricity that's only used for green hydrogen itself? Those things could end up kind of stymieing a lot of major investments in green hydrogen in the US. So it's just a place where we see it to be incredibly policy driven. And in the conversations that we've had with large developers, and particularly a lot of the large IOCs that are getting involved in hydrogen projects, their message, particularly those ones that are heavily involved, for example, in Oman, is that despite the subsidies and the regulatory support that you see in the US, Oman, for example, but I would say the Gulf more generally, remains extremely competitive for those underlying structural reasons. Very cheap costs of renewable energy inputs, very stable investment and policy environment, and the availability of financing and relatively cheap credit, either through a regional private sector, well, international capital markets, or regional financing from government entities or from state-owned enterprises. So even with the big subsidies in the US, the Gulf stays competitive. And when you have everything hanging on these regulatory and subsidy programs, there is a lot more uncertainty than when the devil is in the details about what that financing will look like. So I think the Gulf's in a strong position relative to those.
Okay, Phil. So Phil's saying the Gulf's in a strong position, but is putting a number of other global hubs on the map in Africa, Australia, in the US. Do others want to weigh in? If I'm correct in remembering this, I mean, I think Rami, we had a discussion that you've conducted some research about different potential hubs for hydrogen development as well. So I'm wondering if you'd like to weigh in when you have the time and the bandwidth to look beyond the Gulf. Where are you spending your time looking for kind of hydrogen-related opportunities?
Yeah, I think North Africa specifically has a strong position. North Africa, first of all, they already have existing infrastructure like natural gas pipelines already that could be repurposed for hydrogen exports. They have similar qualities as the Gulf. They have it's basically the sun belt, also wind, lots of sun in that region. And one advantage that they have over the GCC countries is that they are already way much advanced in renewable energy deployment than the Gulf does. I think the UAE has the highest share, like 7% or so. The rest of the GCC, there's a lot of momentum around it. There's a lot in the pipeline to be built, but there's still a very low percentage in terms of renewable energy compared to conventional power. Whereas you see areas like Morocco, Jordan, Tunisia, Algeria, they have a lot of renewable energy already and penetrated into their energy system. So they are, they're ahead of the game in terms of renewables, and so they could be in terms of green hydrogen. But as Philip mentioned, there's still a competitive advantage here. The funds that the GCC countries have, even though if they are behind, they could play catch up and surpass and exceed a lot of these countries and eventually become competitive.
Eleanor, I think you're raising a hand.
I just wanted to add to this that the GCC has a big political advantage. Those are very, very stable countries. And from talking to, investment funds, private equity funds, it seems that the political risk in North Africa is, except maybe Morocco, but it's much higher than it is in the Gulf. And that's a big component of investment decisions.
I think that's a really important point. I mean, investors do not like uncertainty. Kate.
I was actually going to mention that the security situation in the Middle East in general at the moment. I mean, when COP28 started, we already had the Gaza war, but it wasn't the risk of contagion wasn't present at the time. There was worries about it. So now you have issues with, attacks on shipping in the Red Sea. You've got a bit of reticence by some investors to sort of commit to projects. I mean, I saw it after Ukraine. A lot of companies were coming to me and sort of looking to put their, headquarters or put their investments somewhere in North Africa, somewhere in the Gulf. You're not seeing that very much at the moment because it's very difficult to see where we're headed. You've now got Iran, you've got Lebanon, you've got Iraq, you've got so many, various. Yes, we have stable monarchies in these countries. But at the same time, you look at the map, Oman is very close to Yemen. They're rather worried about their situation. So I think to say that that the situation is stable at the moment, I can't see people committing, the billions and trillions that are needed at the moment because it's just so uncertain. That's maybe my opinion because we started off, the oil market was very sanguine about the situation in the Red Sea. We've seen prices move up a little bit. So I think it's a difficult time to be making long-term investment decisions. But having said that, yes, I agree. Morocco is a country that I've worked with very closely. They do have very good relations with, say, Germany is a big supporter of the renewable energy sector in Morocco. So yes, I see Morocco. Egypt, there's a lot of talk, but it doesn't move as quickly. But obviously, they do get a lot of institutional investment, and they continue to do so. They're going to be, I think Mazda is going to be building one of the biggest wind farms in Egypt. They've got the wind. You've got Jordan, which wants to catch up. So I think last year, I think it was the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies identified Saudi Arabia, UAE, Oman, Egypt, Morocco as among 14 potential suppliers to the EU. And I think a lot of it is driven by Germany, of course. And so I think you'll see a lot of these bilateral agreements, but no sort of aggregate market yet that's developing. But I think I don't think we can dismiss the fact that the region is going through a bit of turmoil. So that might have an impact on investment, but that's my opinion.
Yeah, no doubt. I think it's an important point. Look, one point when thinking about North Africa and a point Rami made about repurposing energy infrastructure. Obviously, the kind of process of repurposing energy infrastructure doesn't only apply to kind of North African countries, would apply well to also to Gulf countries. But I've come across a number of studies that are also quite critical about the ability and the feasibility of repurposing different types of energy infrastructure. Wondering to get a view from the participants. I mean, how feasible is the existing energy infrastructure we have in the Gulf, in different Gulf countries? How suitable is that for repurposing for the hydrogen industry? Is a lot of work need to be done? I mean, what are the kind of opportunities and challenges there? Maybe I'll turn it back over to Rami because you bravely brought up the point of repurposing energy infrastructure. So I'll let you pave the way for that part of the discussion.
Yeah, I'm by no means an engineer. I'm not aware of the technicalities of this, but in certain infrastructure, you can blend a certain portion of hydrogen into the natural gas system. But yeah, this hydrogen embrittlement is a serious thing. It needs different metallurgy. Some of the existing gas pipelines cannot handle a lot of volume of hydrogen, or even take it to 100%. Even the end users themselves as well. If you're connected to a turbine or whatever industrial facilities, they also need to change their infrastructure and the importing and exporting facilities as well. I mean, it's a different gas than natural gas. So yeah, but to what extent can we use the existing infrastructure? I think that needs some studying. I mean, so that technical study has to, for the country too, because it's a good way to start, blending hydrogen into the natural gas stream, as a way to kind of, you already have the traditional end users there. And so suppliers will have a market already. But eventually, I mean, to what extent can you use this to 100% hydrogen? That needs to be, I mean, investigated.
Do others have strong views about repurposing infrastructure? If not, Phil, you look like you might.
Well,
be
I
ready
wouldn't say
to say
I wouldn't
something.
say it's a particularly strong view, and I would echo that I'm not an engineer. I think that there was a lot of optimism early on that, particularly if I'm thinking about exports from the region to Europe, that midstream gas infrastructure could be used at like 20 to 30%. There was really high numbers that were thrown around with a hydrogen mix. I think from what I've heard since, technically that is unrealistic, and that it has big effects on sort of pipes and risks within the infrastructure. So that seems to be much less. There seems to be much less enthusiasm now about the ability to repurpose midstream infrastructure, to the point that transporting hydrogen from the Gulf and from the Middle East to Europe, now the discussion is about what kind of dedicated hydrogen infrastructure is going to be needed. And some of the costs for a pipeline like that bandied about have been sort of 28, 30, 35 billion euros. So I think there's going to be a lot of additional costs that we have to remember. I think the other question is, maybe going to that question about exporting hydrogen, is remembering again, what are the end uses? And so if we're just looking to transport renewable energy and use hydrogen as a storage medium, then the alternatives, for example, long distance power cables or the like, suddenly become much more interesting. But in, again, places that are far flung from markets like Oman, like Namibia, the economics of using hydrogen to transport renewable energy becomes much more interesting. So I think that you have to always be keeping in mind, when we talk about midstream and energy delivery, what are the alternatives and what's the end use and the purpose?
How much attention should we be giving to kind of trans-regional global initiatives that have a strong green hydrogen focus? I mean, the one that comes to mind is the IMEC, the India Middle East, India Middle East Europe trade corridor that has that, at least from what we're reading about, and albeit it's a very early nascent stage, seems to have a strong focus on the topic of the day here. How are all of you thinking about that particular corridor, implications for attaching or linking the markets we're talking about here, or at least kind of hydrogen producers to potential global markets? Is it something that we should really be paying attention to, a serious initiative, or is it an idea that still very much has to find a footing and remains to be seen how feasible it will be? Kate, do you want to take a stab at it?
Yeah, I mean, India is price sensitive when it comes to its energy. So, for example, if it can import LNG cheaper than it can import hydrogen, because let's not forget, there's a density issue. You need a lot more space for hydrogen. It doesn't have the same calorific value. Well, it's a vector anyway. It's not actually a fuel source. So, I think it's India will actually choose to import LNG from Qatar if it's cheaper than importing, green hydrogen as ammonia and then regasifying it again, and all the losses that go, I mean, exporting is quite difficult. You can't export it as well as a gas. You can, I suppose, but it takes so much more space to condense it. So I think it's hard to see that sort of taking off immediately. Costs will have to come down. I mean, Philip mentioned costs in the US with the IRA and the subsidies. And I'm looking at the costs in the UAE. They're far higher. They're about double the price, I think, for green hydrogen. It's a lot cheaper to produce blue hydrogen, where the UAE is competitive with its neighbors. But when it comes to green, they're not. I suppose Saudi Arabia has, far bigger plans. They've got much more space, but their renewables haven't caught up yet, so it's difficult to tell. But from what I see, the costs will have to come down a lot for hydrogen to become an important part of that corridor. And I think, yeah, it's early days. I mean, we haven't really seen much And let's not forget, big brother China is somewhere there. They produce most of the electrolyzers of the world. They produce most of the components, and they're going to want a piece of the pie. So I think that's worth watching. But again, as I said, developing a sort of local green economy, electrolyzers being produced, but you need a lot of them. I mean, let's not forget how much energy it takes to split that atom. So hydrogen and oxygen are difficult to split, so you need a hell of a lot more renewable energy, and we're still very low. I think Rami mentioned 7%. I think 7% of total GCC renewables are concentrated in the UAE. So it's scaling up. We're talking trillions of dollars. I've got some numbers here, but I'm not going to bore you with them. So that, as I said, it's a long-term issue, and it needs to develop. But I don't think India is going to be committing at the moment to sort of long-term hydrogen imports from the region unless it can get it at a cost that is competitive with gas.
Okay, Eleanor, did you have a hand raised?
Yeah, happy to jump in. I just wanted to kind of go back to that German initiative that's called, I think, H2 Global, where they're trying to match buyers and sellers and saying we're going to make funds available to match the price difference between, the lowest seller and the highest buyer, right? And Germany apparently is conducting talks with other EU countries to encourage the same model to be reproduced and make European funds available to actually get the green hydrogen market up and going in Europe. And I think that if you have the political will and that governments are making funds available for this, kind of energy to become mainstream in the energy mix, you will see the market moving very fast.
Thank you. Yeah, I think in terms of thinking about different markets, Kate's talked about India. I mentioned the IMEC. I mean, we've talked a bit about Europe. Someone earlier, I'm not sure, I think it was Phil, someone mentioned the importance of kind of Asian markets with specific focus on Japan, South Korea, and to some degree, China. I'm wondering, Phil, can you kind of maybe unpack those different potential markets, those players, and what each of those countries what policymakers in those countries are thinking and the implications that would have for the Gulf in terms of these countries being important export markets moving forward. We have talked at length about China and some of the kind of top-down movement that could happen in terms of producing a hydrogen market if there was the interest and the political will to do so. That could happen relatively quickly and in a streamlined fashion in China. But I guess the question is, to what degree is there really that interest in political will and what implications that will have for the Gulf?
Sure. Well, I mean, just first looking at those East Asian markets, I think starting with Japan. So Japan has really put clean hydrogen at the center of a lot of its energy transition strategy. Remember, Japan is a place that's relatively difficult to build renewable energy because of space constraints, unless it's sort of offshore. And so green hydrogen and development of a demand inside Japan has been something that's been particularly exciting, has been moved forward by policy. So if you're a Middle East producer looking to the Japanese market, both as a transporter of renewable energy and to feed the potentially hard to abate sectors that we've been discussing is important. I think in Korea, it's something similar, right? Looking at an industrial economy where there is a high degree of things like steel production and heavy manufacturing, the ability to use green hydrogen presents an option to decarbonize some of those key industries inside the South Korean economy, and has therefore been pushed forward on that basis. So if we're looking at those kinds of economies that are heavily industrialized, lacking in their own sort of potential for big renewable energy build out, and are also focused on industries where green molecules in particular can make a big difference, that creates the potential for a big demand uptick, again, which is clearly policy driven. On the Chinese side, there's a lot of Chinese ambitions to produce their own hydrogen domestically. And so a lot of the Chinese strategy is more about having a domestic industry that's eventually feeding domestic needs. And so while there will be quite a bit of scope potentially for imports as their industries start to decarbonize, particularly in those heavy areas, the aim is much more to create a domestic ecosystem for hydrogen production in China. So much larger market, but less sort of import focused.
Great, thank you. And we have Rami joining us again, just in time.
Sorry, guys. Yeah, I got disconnected.
No worries at all. I'm going to put one more question out to the group before moving over and starting to integrate and make our way through the questions that have been posed in the question and answer box. But it has to do with the revenue side of things and the financial implications that are expected from the hydrogen development plans. Anyone who follows the Gulf region knows that the traditional hydrocarbon exports, oil and gas, are of critical importance to government revenues. There's a lot of talk about economic diversification, and I don't want to kind of imply that economic diversification has not moved ahead. But if you look at the headline figures, government revenues is still in most countries still predominantly dependent upon oil and gas exports. Obviously, how a hydrogen industry develops will not just have environmental impacts, but it's going to have real impact on government revenues, both if it's replacing those traditional hydrocarbon exports, and also in terms of the actual revenues and returns on investments that those hydrogen initiatives can produce. So, how are all of you thinking about, and/or what are you hearing from energy officials in the Gulf about the revenue and the kind of financial implications, or at least the hopes and expectations that they have associated with hydrogen development? Maybe I'll let Eleanor kick things off, because we had some conversation about this when you came back from COP28, and you also were nice enough to put it on the table in one of your previous remarks. So over to you, Eleanor, and I'll bring others in. Just please jump in afterwards.
Yeah, so I think that there is a lot of research, or like dating back 1980s, about how energy transitions would fundamentally change the face of the types of governments you would see in energy exporting countries. And so the fact that those countries want to move fast on taking the market for the new kind of energy that's going to be needed worldwide is an important kind of strategy, knowing the role that oil and gas rents play in even like the establishment and development of those states, and the social contract that it afforded to establish with its population, and knowing kind of the potential, let's say, more participatory style of governance that green energy is supposed to create, at least according to some research. Of course, I think that those states want to move fast to be able to maintain the political equilibrium that they are at now. So I guess that's more on like the political side of things, on creating alternative sources of rents, and also making sure that they stay central to the world energy system. And I think that green hydrogen, so maybe not as fast as, let's say, European countries want it, because Europe is talking about importing 10 million tons of green hydrogen by 2030 and producing in-house 10 million green hydrogen by 2030, right? So they want both. And so, yeah, so I think that taking up that potential market is something that seems to be key for Gulf countries.
Yeah, well, I mean, even the mention of rents brings in that political dimension. But I think if we would just think about it in terms of just revenues from hydrogen, I'm curious, Phil and Kate, what's the expectations in terms of an alternate revenue source? Are officials very optimistic? I mean, it's hard to believe that we're going to see, you know, in the immediate future, kind of anything in terms of the revenues that will come close to what we've seen historically from crude oil, natural gas, and you know, and other hydrocarbon commodities. I see you nodding, Kate. Maybe we'll start with you and then move to Phil.
Okay, a couple of things. I mean, one of the advantages of all these projects in the Gulf is they are government driven, right? And some of them have investment by, you know, like the PIF in Saudi Arabia. So they move faster. But at the same time, yes, they're not going to generate the same kind of rents, the same kind of revenues as oil and gas. And COP28, what was the big fuss about? Why were they delayed? You know, the final declaration was because of the argument over the language of fossil fuels, as has been, you know, the case at previous COPs. They came up with a compromise solution but who were the countries that were sort of, you know, holdouts? It was Saudi Arabia, it was Iraq, it was Russia, with a few of their allies, you know. And if you believe the IEA, which a lot of people don't, that oil and gas demand, all fossil fuel demand, is going to peak by 2030 or before 2030, then yeah, it makes sense to prepare for that moment. But you are going to hold out because you cannot afford at this moment, because of the social issues, because of the fact that, you know, you're running a deficit in Saudi Arabia this year. Despite the fact that last year we saw, you know, relatively good prices. 2022, we saw near record prices. So a lot of that funding could be diverted into developing renewables. And of course, once you develop renewables, then you don't need to invest so much in upstream capacity, which they're not really doing beyond currently announced plans. Saudi Arabia is not investing anymore in upstream capacity. And I remember back in 2006, the Saudi oil minister at the time, Ali Naimi, said to me that he never saw Saudi Arabia needing to produce anywhere beyond 12 million barrels a day. So you free up more for exports, which you believe, if you are OPEC and the OPEC plus countries, that there is life for oil. Even the COP28 declaration sees some, you know, life for natural gas. So I think that was, or it was interpreted that way. And a lot of these declarations can be interpreted in different ways. We didn't see a carbon tax, which we'll probably see in Azerbaijan when that happens next year. So I think there are pluses to having the governments involved in these projects, that they move quickly, but at the same time, there is a risk, and more so now because you are seeing a lot of, you know, what's going on in the Middle East at the moment. You cannot afford to have any social unrest. You cannot afford to, you know, do away with subsidies completely. And one of the other issues, you know, when we talk about Europe, look at what's happening politically in Europe at the moment. There's a rise in sort of, some countries are seeing a rise in right-wing political movements, which are anti-climate. You know, what impact that will have on the sort of European strategy, I don't know yet. So I think, you know, you've got to look at it both ways. You have elections coming up in the US. That could change the dynamic as well of the whole, you know, energy policy, and that will have an impact on China, relations with China, with Russia. I mean, you know, I think we're in a year of flux. It's very, very difficult to see straight, but I think it's, yeah, you want to move, you want to sort of go with the times. You anticipate the, you know, border adjustment mechanism coming into play, carbon taxes, maybe a carbon price being higher than it is at the moment, which will impact your exports. But at the same time, you need to sort of preserve stability in your own countries. You need to, countries like Iraq, for example, you know, rely almost exclusively on oil and gas. There's no way they would have agreed to a phase out. So I think this is a difficult year. Things need to settle down a little bit, but I think the politics is also important, particularly European politics.
Thank you. Phil or Rami, would you like to weigh in on the kind of revenue side of things, expected revenues with hydrogen?
Yeah, in terms of revenues and rent, now I think we shouldn't expect that the hydrogen would be a one-on-one replacement for oil revenues, and that's for two reasons. First of all, the beauty about hydrogen is you can produce it in many different ways. It's not an extractive industry. I mean, you don't have to have the reserves, just like you do with oil, and then you push it out and someone will take it. The beauty about hydrogen is that you can produce it in many different ways. And many of the importing countries, even traditional importing countries like even North Africa and Europe, can produce hydrogen themselves. So that market, the demand market, is much smaller than the oil market, especially in the trade of hydrogen. It's not going to be as much as trade for oil. And also the second reason is that hydrogen is not the silver bullet for the energy transition. There's many other technologies. Electrification is one technology that many like end users could decarbonize using electrification. So both domestic supplies of hydrogen will increase in many regions, and different low carbon technologies will be used. So all in all, that revenue is not going to be replaced one-on-one. I think in one of the WEO 2022, the IEA did show a chart showing that the revenues from oil exporting countries, especially the Middle Eastern exporting countries, from hydrogen is not going to be one-on-one with oil. So having said that, using this hydrogen domestically, just like what Kate said, because of all these stricter regulations coming, like the CBAM and others may follow suit, it's probably worth it using this hydrogen into diversifying your economy and build manufacturing in the GCC. Use it in steel, use it in aluminum, use it in those hard to abate sectors like cement and other chemicals, fertilizers. That could then translate to export of these semi-finished or finished products, and that could not create value within the GCC in terms of creating jobs and economic growth, but also with export revenues as well, with exporting cleaner products. Sorry.
Thank you.
From hydrogen.
And Phil, just before you add on to that, so by all means, carry on with that line of the discussion. But I'm going to throw an additional question that I think you might be well suited to answer as well. This question is coming in. Last week, it's reported that Turkey's Tosyali holding was considering a $5 billion investment in Saudi Arabia, and it's also talking about decarbonization. Is this a likely downstream user of Neom's green hydrogen plant? And what signs are there of similar feedstock deals emerging elsewhere in the region? I know you're closely watching Neom, so I'll add that into the mix, but please feel free to add on to what Rami was saying.
Sure. Well, just on the revenue discussion, I agree with both Rami and with Kate. I think if we're comparing oil and gas revenues with hydrogen revenues, first, the scale at the moment is just nothing similar, right? So current revenues in the Gulf from oil are something like 1.2, 1.3 trillion. And the most optimistic case, I think it was put out by the World Bank for 2050, is that regional revenues from hydrogen could reach 200 billion. And that is, so already the numbers are very disparate, and that 200 billion number relies on all of these very aggressive policy movements around the world, because you have to imagine this is like standing up simultaneously, not just a three-legged stool, but trying to stand up scale demand in a lot of different sectors with very policy heavy programs, trying to scale supply at the same time, and trying to keep costs relatively low. So to Kate's point, the elections that are coming this year could throw off that policy, or through many other sort of events that could happen in the next several years, that could come into question. On the oil side, there's a lot of reasons to think that even though the oil market may peak in the early 2030s, and even under the most aggressive IEA scenarios, under a net zero scenario, I mean, by 2050, you still have a significant amount of oil and gas demand in the world, about 40% of what it is now, but still a very significant amount. There's a good reason to think that the Gulf producers would be sort of the last man standing, as it were, with the cheapest and least carbon intensive oil and gas production that will mean that their revenues will stand up more strongly as the global market starts declining. So I absolutely do not think that hydrogen is a one-to-one or or even near one-to-one replacement for oil and gas revenues in the region. Rather, I think this is more an oil and gas producing regions play to advance the energy transition in those kind of places where they have expertise and where they know how. I think if we're talking about what are potential off-takers from Gulf production, yes, Turkey certainly a big one. I was in Turkey in December or November, just before going to COP and speaking to the ministries there. They clearly see this to be important, and obviously the Turkish relationship with Saudi Arabia is also one that they want to pursue. And so those kinds of sourcing deals for hydrogen for use in Turkey is one that makes a lot of sense. But I would also say, if we're talking about Neom in particular, there are some interesting deals that they have been closing in the last couple of years with the Chinese, with China Petroleum and Chemical Corporation, and we've already discussed a little bit about Japan and South Korea. So a lot of these, I would say, sort of ambitious commitments that might be sort of MOUs or might not actually be final offtake agreements, but might be sort of commitments to think about offtaking in the future. At this point, a lot of them are politically driven. And so I see some of those Turkish deals with the Saudis kind of within that lens, as much as a long-term partnership or an exclusive partnership for hydrogen sourcing in the region.
Very interesting. Another question here. The renewable energy, especially solar, that advocates hydrogen production in the Gulf, that advocates of hydrogen production in the Gulf, North Africa, Southern Africa, and even the US and Australia for that matter, all requires a huge amount of water. I don't hear the issue of water scarcity and everyone's optimistic outlook here. Isn't it a major challenge going forward? I think as a small caveat, I believe Kate did mention that water is a big issue. So maybe but maybe I'll give you the chance now to elaborate on that, Kate. And if anybody else would feel free to raise your hand with the button or just on your screen, and we'll let you weigh in too. So Kate, water issue, how does it play into this?
Yeah, I did say that was one of the issues, because a lot of the water in the Gulf is desalinated water, and we're using gas to desalinate, natural gas. So yes, there are, reverse osmosis increasingly is being touted. I think Neom has very ambitious plans to have clean water, recyclable water. I met somebody the other day who is talking about trying to get more water recycled in the region, but ultimately we are using natural gas for desalination. So that is an issue. You've got the methane pledge now, so that's something that has to be tackled if you're using gas. So you're going to have to find ways to make yours. I think you need about, I don't know how many liters you need of purified water to produce a kilogram of hydrogen. I think it's about 9 or 10 or something like that. So, producing that water is difficult. You're in a very, very arid part of the world, which is being affected by climate change. So, the sea is becoming more saline. So there are a lot of roadblocks, and water is one of them. Not so much investment and, markets. And as I said earlier, it's sort of, green hydrogen, I think, is still 1% because we produce a lot of hydrogen, a lot of it not clean, but, hydrogen is produced today as part of the refining process. But green is such a small percentage. And I think I was looking at numbers of just how much you need, for example, because you're not talking just hydrogen, the plans are there on paper, but the fact that you actually need to scale up, I think Oman needs 5 billion just to reach its target by 2030, before it starts producing, and then much more to produce hydrogen. So I think that's the water issue, I think, is important, and it's going to become more so as projects.
Can I add something to that, Robert?
Please, Rami, go ahead.
Yeah, at CapStark, we did do an analysis, like a cost analysis on, green hydrogen projects in Saudi Arabia using desalinated water, using reverse osmosis, so using renewable electricity to process desalinated water and purify it. we noticed that the from a cost perspective and even an energy intensity perspective, overall, it's relatively low. So desalination of water for a green hydrogen facility makes up about 1%, 1 to 2%. I mean, your biggest cost is your renewable electricity and your electrolyzer. And even when it comes to the energy requirement to produce the water for, so 1 ton of hydrogen or even 1 million tons of hydrogen, it's not as relatively, it's not as high as the energy required to split the water itself. So, in my opinion, it's having this region, understands desalination. I mean, they have one of the highest capacities in the world when it comes to desalinated water. What they could do is, you can build a large facilities, because economies of scale here would be in your favor, and use some of that water not just for electrolysis, but also use it for municipal uses. So in my opinion, it's not a deal breaker. The water issue in the GCC, especially the coastal areas where you have access to seawater. I think where the issue becomes is the sustainability aspect. As I mentioned with the definition of green hydrogen, some certification schemes do require, there's a social aspect behind, land use, water use, involving indigenous communities, things like that. So, dumping back the rejected brine back to the ocean or the sea is that's a no-go. So more needs to be done in treating the brine and what you do with it, to have like a sustainable use of this water. But in terms of cost, I think, especially here for the GCC, it's I don't think it's an issue.
Thank you, Rami. Let me try to get through 2 more questions, and that will probably take us right about to the end of our allotted time. The first one has to do with subsidies. Subsidies came up a couple of times today during our discussion, but we also know that Gulf governments have been trying for many years now with I'd say a mixed bag of success to advance subsidy reform across various sectors of the economy. I guess so it's a good question here that one of the audience members asked about what level of subsidies will be required in the Gulf to make green hydrogen, or the demand for it, economical for the hard to abate industries. I mean, at a time when I guess the trend is to move toward subsidy reform and removing subsidies, that's at least a very clear trend in the region. Will hydrogen throw a wrench in those plans? I mean, will we actually have to see significant subsidies coming online to support these plans? What are your views on the subsidy part of this debate?
Well, I think currently the incentives in the GCC are very skewed towards hydrocarbon uses, and that needs to change if hydrogen would need to be used in these hard to abate sectors. As I mentioned, we even globally, a lot of the subsidies or incentives are very skewed to the supply side. Here, I think the issue with the supply side, already natural gas supply is the administrative prices are very low, even with renewable prices. The issue is with the demand side. Is how do you drive, or how do you subsidize or incentivize the demand side to procure clean hydrogen? And I think, we've talked about incentives, the regulatory framework. There needs to be some driver. I mentioned mandates could be one way you can drive demand, force end users to use a portion of their energy or a portion of their feedstock as hydrogen. But you do need to, have some, supportive measures there to in order for them to make that switch. So I think, that's lacking, and think more needs to be done, or skew these incentives from more hydrocarbons towards, cleaner fuels.
Okay, I'm going to mandate Phil to weigh in on subsidies here.
Sure. No, I mean, I agree with Rami. I think when we think about the subsidies, particularly on hydrogen end use, so things like in hard to abate sectors like green steel, the cost differential, depending on the price of hydrogen, can be something like 20 to 22%, something like that, on green steel. So the issue there is really on the demand side and how you make the economics work. So a lot of the efforts in terms of scaling up a market for green end uses where hydrogen is the major feedstock have been focusing on these advanced market mechanisms, which I mentioned at the beginning, programs like the First Movers Coalition, which has been pushed by the World Economic Forum and by John Kerry here in the US, is really about getting commitments from large steel users, cement users, in the case of green cement, to adopt those and to pledge their use in those in the future in order to catalyze the investment that's necessary to scale up the green hydrogen and also the green steel and green cement infrastructure that's necessary to produce that. So that's been a lot of the efforts, I think, in terms of trying to meet those two things. Because again, as we stand up and scale all of these industries at the same time, the issue is to drive down the cost of the hydrogen and of the processes that are made to produce this green steel or green cement, such that they can eventually be competitive, and that requires companies committing to that higher price in advance. I think when it comes to the actual subsidies on green hydrogen, particularly green hydrogen production itself, I think in the Gulf, the issue is that they're relatively implicit. So it will come through state-owned enterprises or through preferential financing, but it's not the same as we see, for example, in the US, which is a direct subsidy for green hydrogen production. So I think in both of these areas, I mean, where the subsidy and where the let's say the public support comes in is at different parts in the process. But I think, what's going to be very important is to prove eventually that there's a market beyond traditional areas like fertilizer, which even in something like 2035 continue to be a really large user of hydrogen, but to move to places where markets don't yet exist. So steel, cement, we talk about a lot, but also Rami mentioned aviation. I mean, this is a place where the realistic use of hydrogen, for example, on long distance travel, is at least 15 to 20 years out. And for on the other side, when we think about the option for electrification that he mentioned, I think about things like heavy trucking, where hydrogen was bandied about as a option, particularly for long distance heavy trucking in the last several years. But as batteries have developed much further, that part of the trucking fleet, which can then be electrified at a lower cost to hydrogen, has been expanding rapidly. So again, that's not as much of a market as we expected. So the key is really going to be the subsidies and support to creating that demand.
Great. We're running low on time, so I'm going to let Kate give a comment here, and then I'll have a last question from the audience on quickly expanding on the role of Germany regarding kind of green hydrogen market and its links to the Gulf. I'll pass that to Eleanor to finish off the event. So, Kate.
Yeah, very, very quickly, because I'm very nosy, I was looking at the questions coming in, and I noticed that one of our former colleagues said that she understood that the Neom project, the green hydrogen project, had actually reached FID, and it's the largest project of its kind. And I think we've reported this at MEES. I think that's sort of 8.4 billion, if I'm not mistaken. So it has reached FID. I think it was a response to maybe Phillip saying it hadn't reached FID, unless I'm mistaken, and Rami or Phillip can correct me. But subsidies. I think it's not just subsidies that are important to sort of encourage people to accept hydrogen, but I think public awareness as well, because there's a lot of people who don't really have any idea of, what a hydrogen, what hydrogen is all about. And so I think public awareness is another important one in this part of the world. So you don't hear people talk about hydrogen very much.
Thank you, Kate. We're coming to the end, but I'll give the floor to Eleanor to tackle the question, this final question we can manage on Germany and its role in this discussion.
Yes, sure. So there is this, I think it's a foundation, German foundation, that's called H2 Global, all right? And they kind of have pledged 900 million euros for ramping up the green hydrogen market. Basically, they're going to do like a call for tender, kind of an auction type of thing with two sides, the seller side and the buyer side. And they pledge to pay for the difference between the highest bidder and the lowest seller, and pay actually the price difference between the two. So that's what I've been hearing and talking about with some of German people. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Well, we are beyond 10:30. Thank you for all of you, all of the speakers who joined and stayed with us for an hour and a half and lent us their time, their expertise, and their insights. And thank you for everyone who joined. We look forward to having you all back here again, either as a participant or an audience member for an upcoming event. Thank you.